She was always taught to hide her body as if it were a curse. He learned early that controlling others was the only way not to be hurt again. But when he makes an indecent proposal, she does not hesitate and smiles. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end. Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment saying where you are watching from. Abigail always knew she wasn't like other women. At 28, she carried on her shoulders the weight of a lifetime spent in the shadows, as if her very existence were a sin that needed constant atonement. She had grown up in the arid mountains of Virginia, in a wooden house that creaked with the wind, where each floorboard seemed to whisper prayers of penitence. There, under the watchful eye of her mother, Hope, she learned that the body was a profaned temple, that desires were demons to be exorcised, and that purity was the only currency accepted in the kingdom of heaven. Hope had been a missionary for a sect that preached isolation as salvation. After years lost in the wilderness, preaching to farmers and suspicious locals, she had returned to civilization carrying in her womb a child whose paternity she never revealed. Abigail was born wrapped in secrets and silences, on a cold dawn when crickets seemed to sing lamentations. Since then, her life had been shaped by the rigidity of a faith that knew no compassion, only control. There were no mirrors in the house. Hope considered them portals of vanity, windows through which the devil spied on the soul. Abigail grew up without knowing her own face, discovering herself only in fleeting reflections of puddles or in the fogged glass of the kitchen's only window. Her dresses were long grey, closed up to the neck, her hair always tied in a tight bun that gave her headaches, her nails cut short so they could neither scratch nor caress, her voice trained to whisper only what was necessary. Music was forbidden. Hope said that melodies were traps set by the tempter, entering through the ears and corrupting the heart. The old radio they had inherited from the property's previous owner remained silent on the shelf, like an abandoned altar. Abigail learned to find rhythm in the irregular beating of her own heart, in the rain pounding on the zinc roof, in the dragging of bare feet across worn wooden floors. It was a secret symphony that only she could hear, a silent rebellion that grew in her bones like poisonous ivy. Touch was the greatest sin. Hope didn't hug, didn't caress, didn't console with affection. Her hands were instruments of correction, never of affection. Abigail learned that skin was forbidden territory, that fingers were walking temptations, that the body itself was a permanent betrayal of the soul's purity. She slept with her hands tied behind her back, so she couldn't touch herself during dreams. She bathed in the dark, so she couldn't see herself. She dressed and undressed as if handling thorns, avoiding any prolonged contact with herself. But beneath all this repression, something pulsed, a silent restlessness like embers hidden under ashes. Abigail felt, even without understanding, that there was an unexplored territory in her body, a secret geography that her mother feared more than any demon. In dreams sometimes she flew. She felt wind on her naked skin, sun in her loose hair, freedom in limbs that moved without shame. She would wake up sweating, heart racing, carrying in her skin the phantom memory of a pleasure she didn't know but recognized as hers by right. Hope seemed to sense these moments. She would appear in the early morning with holy water and angry prayers, sprinkling her daughter as if she were a fire to be extinguished. She forced her to kneel on the cold floor of the improvised chapel in the yard, among cracked plaster saints and candles that dripped wax like tears. She made her repeat jaculatory prayers until her voice became hoarse, until the words lost meaning and transformed into empty noise. The closest neighbors lived miles away. Abigail grew up without knowing what friends were, without games, without secrets shared in whispers. Her only company was the library Hope had brought from the sect, books of gloomy theology, treatises on the sinful nature of flesh, biographies of saints who flagellated themselves to death. Abigail devoured those pages like someone seeking clues to a mystery, trying to decipher between the lines exactly what made the body so dangerous, so worthy of so much fear. It was thus, between prayers and penances, that she found the diary. It was hidden in a crack in the wall of her mother's room, wrapped in cloth like a profane relic. The pages, yellowed by time, contained familiar handwriting, but the words were strange. Symbols mixed with phrases in Latin, fragmented confessions, accounts of erotic dreams described with the feverish language of mystics. It was as if Hope had a double life, a secret existence that contradicted everything she preached. Abigail read those fragments like someone decoding a dead language, feeling that each word was a key to understanding not only her mother, but herself. The diary spoke of a man, someone powerful, seductive, who had offered Hope a different world from the one she had chosen to live in. There were mentions of a child, broken promises, a pact sealed in blood and tears. The final pages were smudged, illegible as if they had been wet with rain or tears. Abigail kept the notebook close to her body, under her dress, feeling it pulse against her skin like a strange heart. Death came on a stormy night, when lightning tore the sky like divine fingernails. Abigail woke to the smell of smoke and the crackling of flames that were already devouring the living room. Hope had fallen near the window, her body contorted in an impossible position, as if she had tried to escape something coming from within, not from outside. Around her, burned paper danced in the air like black snow. Abigail managed to save only the diary and the gold chain that her mother always wore hidden under her blouse. The firefighters arrived when it was already too late. The investigation was perfunctory. Old house, precarious electrical installation, inevitable accident. Abigail signed papers she didn't understand, received condolences from people she didn't know, buried her mother in a cemetery where the names on the tombstones were illegible. She was left alone in the world at 28, without money, without family, without an explainable past. It was then that she found, among Hope's charred belongings, a sealed envelope with her name on it. Inside, a brief letter and a bus ticket to Chicago. The trembling handwriting said only, "Seek your destiny where your sin was born. The truth is in what you don't see." In the envelope, there was also a business card, Montgomery Corp., address on Michigan Avenue. Abigail departed on a gray morning, taking only a small suitcase and her mother's secrets. During the interminable hours of the journey, as the landscape changed from mountains to plantations, from small towns to infinite metropolis, she felt that she wasn't just changing location, but life. Each mile separated her more from what she had been, without yet knowing what she would become. Chicago received her with its urban brutality, its gray sky, its multitude of anonymous faces. Abigail walked the streets like someone navigating a nightmare, lost among buildings that rose like artificial mountains, cars that roared like mechanized beasts, people who moved with the haste of those fleeing something invisible. She didn't know that, at that exact moment, in a glass-walled penthouse on the top floor of the Montgomery Court building, someone was waiting for her, someone who carried in their own scars the other half of the story she was about to discover. Montgomery Corp occupied 40 floors of glass and steel in the heart of Michigan Avenue, rising among other corporate giants like a black monolith that reflected Chicago's gray sky. Abigail stopped on the sidewalk, her neck aching from looking up so much, trying to find the end of that tower that seemed to pierce the clouds. The business card was damp in her sweaty hand, the golden letters shining against the dark background like a promise or a threat. The lobby was a universe of marble and silence, where her steps echoed like sins confessed in an empty cathedral. Executives in impeccable suits glided between columns, speaking in languages she didn't recognize, carrying leather portfolios that seemed to contain the secrets of the world. Abigail felt like a stain in that immaculate environment, with her dark dress of cheap fabric and worn shoes that whispered against the polished floor. The receptionist, a woman of artificial beauty and programmed smile, examined the card with suspicion. She made some whispered calls, typed codes into a gleaming computer, consulted lists that Abigail couldn't see. After minutes that seemed like hours, she pointed to the elevators with a mechanical gesture. 40th floor. Ask to speak with Mr. Montgomery. The elevator rose in silence, carrying Abigail through the layers of corporate hierarchy. At each floor, she saw through the glass doors a new configuration of power. Meeting rooms where men discussed graphs projected on giant screens, corridors lined with certificates and awards, panoramic offices where efficient secretaries moved like pieces of an invisible clock. The world outside shrank with each floor, Chicago transforming into a distant board where tiny people executed movements whose meaning could only be understood from above. The doors opened on the top floor, revealing an environment different from everything she had seen below. Here there were no glass partitions or democratic open spaces. A solitary corridor, lined with dark wood and illuminated by discreet lamps, led to a single door at the end. The walls were decorated with black and white photographs, men in tuxedos at solemn events, buildings being inaugurated, handshakes that seemed to seal destinies. Abigail walked slowly, feeling that each step took her deeper into a web whose threads she couldn't see. The secretary who attended her was different from the lobby receptionist. Older, more observant, with eyes that seemed to capture details that others didn't even notice. She dressed with discreet elegance, spoke in a low voice, moved with the precision of someone who had learned to serve without being noticed. She examined Abigail with an interest that went beyond professional curiosity, as if recognizing something familiar in that unknown face. "Mr. Montgomery is in a meeting," she said, consulting a calendar that seemed to contain much more than work appointments. "But I can fit you in for a preliminary interview. Did you bring a resume?" Abigail shook her head, feeling inadequate. The secretary smiled with a gentleness that had something maternal about it. "Don't worry. Some things are more important than experience." She pointed to a leather chair in a silent anteroom. "Wait here, and prepare yourself." Abigail waited for 2 hours, observing the discreet movement of that executive floor. She saw important men enter and leave the president's office, some with satisfied expressions, others with the closed face of someone who had just lost something valuable. She noticed that the secretary noted everything in a discreet notebook: schedules, expressions, whispered comments. It was as if that office were a theater, where each gesture had meaning, each word was weighed and measured. It was then that the door opened and she saw him for the first time. Caleb Montgomery wasn't what Abigail expected from a corporate magnate. At 39, he carried in his body an elegance that seemed natural, as if he had been born wearing tailored suits. Tall, with broad shoulders and controlled movements, he walked with the confidence of someone who never needed to doubt his own power. But it was his eyes that impressed her, dark, intense, with that peculiar quality of someone who had learned to see people as puzzles to be solved. He studied her for seconds that seemed eternal, his gaze traversing her face with the same attention he would devote to an important document. Abigail felt naked under that scrutiny, as if he could see through the dark dress, the rigid posture, the defenses carefully constructed. But she didn't lower her eyes. Something inside her, perhaps the rebellious heritage she had inherited from forbidden dreams, refused to submit to that first test. "Abigail," he said, and his voice had the quality of aged whiskey, smooth but with a burn that consumed from within. "Interesting name, of Germanic origin. Means noble by nature." He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let's see if the name does justice to the person." The interview took place in his own office, an environment that seemed straight out of a noir film. Walls lined with ancient books, a mahogany desk that could serve as an altar, huge windows that framed Chicago like a mutable painting. Caleb settled behind the desk, gesturing for her to sit in a chair strategically positioned so that the window light shone directly on her face. The questions began conventionally: education, experience, expectations. Abigail answered with brutal honesty, admitting that she had no college diploma, that her experience was limited to helping her mother with household chores, that she didn't even know how to use a modern computer. She expected to be dismissed right there, but Caleb merely nodded, as if those deficiencies confirmed something he already suspected. "And why did you come looking for me?" he asked, leaning back in his chair with a casual gesture that didn't hide the absolute attention with which he awaited her answer. Abigail hesitated. She could invent a story about seeking opportunities in the big city, about wanting to rebuild her life after the tragedy. But something in the way he looked at her suggested that lies would be identified and punished. "My mother left your card among her belongings. I think she sent me here for a reason I don't yet understand. Your mother knew me. I don't know. She died without explaining much." Caleb stood up and walked to the window, hands crossed behind his back, contemplating the city that stretched to the horizon. Abigail observed him in silence, noting the almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers contracted when he thought. He was a man accustomed to controlling everything around him, but something in that conversation was disturbing him. "I'm going to make you a proposal," he said, turning to face her. "I need a personal secretary, someone discreet, someone who understands that certain things should remain private. The salary is generous, the work is demanding, and I don't accept resignations. Once you enter my circle, you stay until I decide you can leave." Abigail felt a chill down her spine. There was something in the way he pronounced those words that transformed the job offer into something darker, almost a Faustian contract. "And if I don't accept?" "You will accept," he said with a certainty that left no room for arguments. "Because you have nowhere to go. Because you need to discover why your mother brought you to me, and because—" He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Because you recognize in me something that also exists in you." Abigail didn't know what to answer to that, but she felt the truth of those words like a punch to the stomach. There was indeed something familiar about that man, a quality that resonated with the darkest parts of her own nature. Perhaps it was the way he looked at her without moral judgment, as if he understood that behind the modest facade existed a more complex and dangerous creature. "When do I start?" she asked, and it was only upon hearing her own voice that she realized she had made the decision. "Now," answered Caleb, touching a button on his desk. The secretary appeared immediately, as if she had been waiting outside. "Rebecca, prepare the admission documents and provide an apartment for Miss Abigail. Something close so she can be available when necessary." Rebecca nodded and left, taking Abigail with her to take care of the formalities. But before crossing the door, Abigail looked back and found Caleb still standing by the window, observing her with an expression that mixed satisfaction and something that seemed almost recognition. As if, after years of searching, he had finally found the missing piece in a puzzle he had been assembling for a long time. That night, alone in the furnished apartment that the company had provided, Abigail opened her mother's diary and reread the cryptic passages in the light of a new perspective. The references to a powerful man, to pacts sealed in blood and tears, to the child who had been left behind when everything collapsed. For the first time, she began to suspect that her arrival at Montgomery Corp was not a coincidence, but the fulfillment of a destiny written long before she was born. And as the city pulsed outside, infinite and indifferent, Abigail felt that she had just taken the first step in a dance whose moves she didn't know, but which her body recognized as if she had been created exactly for this. Abigail's first days at Montgomery Corp were a brutal immersion into the world that Caleb inhabited. She woke before dawn, when Chicago still slept under its blanket of smog, and arrived at the office while the night security guards were still making their rounds through the empty corridors. The silence of those early hours had something sacred about it, as if the entire building were a temple dedicated to corporate gods who demanded daily sacrifices of sweat and ambition. Rebecca taught her the rituals of that secular religion. How to prepare coffee exactly as Caleb liked it, 3 spoons of crystal sugar dissolved in counterclockwise circles. How to organize documents in order of strategic urgency, not chronological. How to identify by the tone of voice of each interlocutor the level of importance that should be attributed to their calls. "Mr. Montgomery doesn't like surprises," Rebecca explained with the patience of an experienced teacher. "He needs to know everything before it happens, to control every variable before it becomes a problem." Abigail absorbed these lessons with the thirst of someone who had finally found a purpose. After years of living in a bubble of religious silence, the complexity of that corporate universe fascinated her. It was like learning a new language, where each gesture had meaning. Each document contained layers of information that needed to be decoded. Each meeting was a theater where powerful actors played carefully rehearsed roles. Caleb, in turn, observed her with the attention of an entomologist studying a rare species. He appeared in her field of vision at the most unexpected moments. When she organized files in the basement depository, when she drank coffee alone in the silent kitchen during lunch hour, when she worked late, reviewing contracts that others would consider impossible to understand. He never spoke on these occasions, he just observed, as if trying to decipher a code that she carried without knowing. "You're different from the others," he said during one of these appearances, emerging behind her when Abigail was organizing old documents in the dead files. It was late afternoon, the floor was empty, and the yellowish light from the lamps created dancing shadows between the metal shelves. "The other secretaries who passed through here wanted to impress, please seduce. You just absorb, like a silent sponge." Abigail didn't turn around, continuing to separate the papers with precise movements. "Maybe I have nothing to prove," she replied, surprising herself with her own audacity. "Or maybe I've learned that impressing is a form of lying. And you don't lie?" "Everyone lies." The difference is knowing when it's worth it. Caleb took a few steps, positioning himself beside her between the shelves. Abigail felt the heat emanating from his body, the subtle aroma of his perfume mixed with the smell of old paper and ink. It was the first time they had been alone in a confined space, and the proximity created an electric tension that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "And when is it worth lying to you?" Abigail finally turned to face him. Caleb was closer than she had imagined, close enough for her to see the small scars that marked his face, vestiges of some ancient violence that he carried like secret medals. "When the truth hurts more than it protects," she said, keeping her gaze steady on his. "Interesting." Caleb extended his hand and lightly touched her wrist, where the skin was exposed between the sleeve of her dress and the glove she always wore. The touch was brief, almost imperceptible, but Abigail felt as if an electric current had traveled through her entire body. "You have an accelerated pulse. Are you nervous?" "I'm alert." "Is there a difference?" "Nervous implies fear. Alert implies preparation." Caleb smiled, and this time the smile reached his eyes, transforming him into a different creature, younger, almost vulnerable. "Preparation for what?" "For you," said Abigail, and the words left her mouth before she could censor them. "Since the first day I feel that you've been testing me, measuring me for something. I just don't know yet for what." Very perceptive, Caleb moved away, walking between the shelves like a predator that delimits territory. "The truth is that I need someone for a special project, something that requires absolute discretion and certain qualities that aren't easily found on the market." "What kind of qualities?" "The ability to keep secrets, to not judge what you see, to remain loyal even when loyalty becomes inconvenient." He stopped in front of a specific shelf, his fingers running along the spines of the files as if looking for something, and especially the ability to commit completely to a cause, even without understanding its motives. Abigail felt a chill down her spine. There was something in the way he pronounced commit that transformed the professional expression into something more intimate and dangerous. "And if I don't have those qualities?" "You do." Caleb removed a file from the shelf, a yellow dossier with her photo on the cover. Abigail recognized the image. It was a photograph from when she was 7, taken in a park near the property where she had grown up. But how was it possible that that photo was there? "The question is whether you are willing to use them." "How did you get that?" "Your mother wasn't the only person to work for my family, Abigail. The past has long tentacles, and some reach into the present when we least expect it." Caleb opened the dossier, revealing pages of documents, photographs, handwritten notes. Hope Pierce worked as a housekeeper at the Montgomery family farm between 1995 and 1998. She was dismissed after an incident. Abigail felt the world spin around her. Hope had never mentioned having worked for anyone besides the religious sect. The entire narrative of her life had been built on the foundation of a carefully crafted lie. What kind of incident? The kind that involves forbidden passions, female jealousy, and attempted murder. Caleb closed the dossier with a dry snap. "Your mother tried to kill my stepmother on a December night in 1998. She almost succeeded. If it weren't for the intervention of a child who witnessed everything." "What child?" "Me." The word fell between them like a stone thrown into a silent lake. "I was 11 years old, Abigail, and I remember you perfectly." The dead files room seemed to shrink around them, the shelves closing like walls in an arena where two gladiators prepared for a combat whose rules had not yet been established. Abigail felt that her entire life, all the certainties she had built about her origin and identity, were crumbling like sandcastles touched by the tide. "That's impossible." "I would remember. You were very young, and you went through trauma after the incident. The doctors said it was common in cases like this, for the mind to block painful memories." Caleb approached again, but this time he didn't touch. He just stood close enough for her to feel his breathing. "But I remember how you used to appear at the boundary between the properties, always alone, always silent. How we played without words, communicating through gestures and glances. How I promised that I would protect you on that last afternoon before everything collapsed. Why are you telling me this now? Because I need you to understand that nothing that has happened until now was a coincidence. Your mother died knowing that you would come looking for me. She left enough clues for you to reach me, but not enough for you to immediately understand the meaning of your presence here." Caleb leaned against the shelf, arms crossed, studying her with the same intensity as always. "You are a debt I need to pay, Abigail. A promise I need to fulfill, but not in the way that an 11-year-old child imagined doing." "How then?" "By offering you something your mother could never give, the truth about who you really are, about what you carry in your blood, about the desires that you learned to bury so deep that you don't even recognize them anymore." Caleb's voice became a dangerous whisper. "But this truth has a price, Abigail, and it can only be paid in one way." "Which?" "With your absolute trust, with your unconditional obedience, with your complete surrender to the process of discovery." Caleb straightened up, once again assuming the posture of the relentless executive. "If you accept, we'll begin tonight. At my apartment. At 9 o'clock. Abigail felt that she was on the edge of a precipice, about to take a leap that would change her life forever. She could refuse, quit, flee from Chicago as she had fled from the Virginia mountains. But she knew that she wouldn't flee. Not just because she had nowhere to go, but because, for the first time in her life, she felt that she was about to find answers to questions she didn't even know she carried. "And if I accept," she said, "how will I know that I can trust you?" Caleb smiled, but this time the smile had something fierce about it, like that of a wolf that finally corners its prey after a long and patient hunt. "You won't. That's the beauty of it, Abigail. True trust only exists when it is given without guarantees." He left the archive, leaving her alone among the shelves, surrounded by dossiers that contained the secrets of other lives, other betrayals, other pacts sealed in darkness. Abigail remained there for a long time, holding the file with her childhood photo, trying to decipher what she felt. Fear, certainly. Excitement, without a doubt. But there was something more, something she recognized as familiar despite never having experienced it before. It was the sensation of finally waking from a 28-year dream, ready to discover who she really was when she wasn't pretending to be someone that her mother had wanted her to be. Abigail spent the rest of the afternoon like a ghost, traversing the corridors of Montgomery Corp, fulfilling her mechanical tasks, while her mind seethed with revelations that threatened to destroy everything she thought she knew about herself. Each document she organized, each call she answered, each procedure she executed seemed to happen in a parallel dimension, while her real consciousness remained trapped in the dead files room, digesting the impossibility that Caleb Montgomery was the boy from her lost childhood. At 6 in the evening, when the building began to empty and the last executives said goodbye to their air-conditioned offices, Abigail found herself alone at her desk, pretending to review reports while observing through the glass partition Caleb's office. He was on the phone, gesturing with the contained energy of someone accustomed to giving orders that didn't admit questioning. The late afternoon light created angular shadows on his face, accentuating the lines of a beauty that had something predatory about it, as if genetics had conspired to create a man made exclusively to hunt. At 8:30, he emerged from the office adjusting his tie, his eyes finding hers through the glass with a precision that couldn't be casual. He approached her desk with feline movements, resting his palms on the wooden surface and leaning until their faces were separated by only centimeters. "Don't be late," he said, his low voice carrying a veiled threat. "And bring your mother's diary. We'll need it." Abigail felt her blood freeze in her veins. How did he know about the diary? He had mentioned Hope's papers, but not specifically the notebook that she kept as a profane relic. "How do you know that?" "I know many things, Abigail. More than you imagine." Caleb straightened up, adjusting his shirt cuffs with precise gestures. "The address is on the desk. Don't disappoint me. Tentar Novamente, a continue editar plotted translation strategy for Portuguese literary narrative. I need to continue the English translation of this Portuguese story, which appears to be a literary fiction, with elements of romance, mystery, and psychological drama. The story is about a character originally named Adelaide, whom I've renamed Abigail in the English translation. In the previous section, I translated the beginning of the story where Abigail, who was raised in isolation by her religious mother Hope, finds herself working for a mysterious businessman named Caleb Montgomery, formerly Cesar Montavani, after her mother's death. The story has a dark, gothic tone with suggestions of forbidden desires and family secrets I've been asked to translate from Portuguese to American, English change names of characters and locations to American names. Maintain the original. Length, continue until I reach the output limit. I need to pick up exactly where I left off in the translation, making sure to maintain the tone, style, and narrative flow of the original story. He departed, leaving only the aroma of his cologne and a card on which was written an address in Wicker Park. Abigail kept the paper in her purse with trembling hands, already planning her escape route. She could take her few belongings from the apartment, buy a bus ticket to anywhere distant, start over in some small town where nobody knew her name. But even as she elaborated these plans, she knew she wouldn't execute them. The curiosity that hope had tried to kill in her with prayers and penances now resurfaced with multiplied force, demanding answers that only Caleb seemed to possess. The apartment was in a discreet building, a modernist construction from the 60s that had resisted the demolitions and renovations that had transformed the neighborhood. Abigail climbed the 4 flights of stairs, her heart beating at a rhythm she couldn't control, her mother's diary weighing in her purse as if it were made of lead. The door opened before she could knock, revealing Caleb in dark jeans and a white shirt, barefoot, a more intimate and dangerous version of the executive she had met. The interior of the apartment surprised her. She expected opulence, ostentatious decoration, the clichés of masculine wealth. Instead, she found a minimalist space where each object seemed to have been chosen for its emotional value, not monetary. White walls decorated with black and white photographs of places that seemed to have personal significance. Shelves filled with books whose spines revealed eclectic tastes: philosophy, psychology, erotic literature, treatises on power and manipulation. A grand piano occupied a corner of the living room, its yellowed keys suggesting frequent use. "Would you like something to drink?" asked Caleb, directing her to a dark leather sofa positioned in front of a window that framed the city lights. "I have wine, whiskey, or I can make tea if you prefer something less compromising." "Tea is fine," replied Abigail, choosing the option that would give her more control over her own reflexes. Caleb disappeared into the kitchen, leaving her alone to examine the environment. The photographs on the walls told fragmented stories: a farm in ruins, children playing in a creek, a man in a suit in a boardroom, a woman in a white dress on a porch. Abigail recognized some settings. They were from the region where she had grown up, but seen from angles that suggested a different perspective, perhaps that of a child observing from a distance. "Do you recognize anything?" asked Caleb, returning with 2 porcelain cups that exhaled aromatic steam. He sat on the sofa beside her, close enough that their thighs almost touched. "I had some memories framed after I learned you were coming to Chicago." "How did you know I was coming?" "Your mother wrote me a letter before she died. It arrived a week after the funeral." Caleb took a sip of tea, his eyes never leaving her face. "It said that the time had come for you to discover the truth about your origin, and that I was the only person capable of guiding you in this discovery." "Why you?" "Because I was a witness. Because I carried her secrets all these years. And because—" He paused, setting the cup down on the coffee table. "Because I promised a 7-year-old girl that I would protect her when she grew up, even if the protection wasn't the kind a child could understand." Abigail felt that she was being led somewhere dangerous, but couldn't resist the attraction that pulled her forward. "What kind of protection?" "Protection against yourself, Abigail. Against the desires you inherited from your mother. Against the nature that hope tried to suffocate with religion and fear." Caleb leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, assuming the posture of a secular confessor. "Your mother wasn't the saint she pretended to be. She was a passionate, sensual woman, capable of extreme acts when moved by desire. And you carry the same fire in your blood." "I don't know what you're talking about." "No? Then explain to me why you're here, Abigail. Why you accepted coming to the apartment of a man you barely know at night, alone, knowing that he has plans for you that he hasn't fully revealed." Caleb's voice became hypnotic, each word pronounced with the precision of a surgeon making incisions. "Because the repressed woman your mother created would flee. But the real Abigail, the one who exists beneath the layers of religious conditioning, she knows that she's exactly where she should be." Abigail opened her mouth to protest, but the words died in her throat. There was a terrible truth in what he said, a visceral recognition that all the years of repression had not eliminated something fundamental in her nature. They had only buried it deeper. "I want to see the diary," said Caleb, extending his hand. "I promise to return it, but I need to confirm some suspicions before we proceed." Abigail hesitated, the notebook burning inside her purse like live coal. It was the last thing left of Hope, the only tangible link with the past she had just discovered to be an elaborate fiction. But Caleb waited with the patience of someone accustomed to getting everything he wanted. And she knew that refusal at that moment would mean the end of any chance of discovering the truth. She removed the diary from her purse and handed it over, watching as he leafed through the yellowed pages with almost religious reverence. She knew every word of those fragmented confessions, every coded symbol, every tear stain that blurred the ancient ink. But Caleb seemed to be reading a different story, his eyes capturing meanings that escaped her. "Here," he said, pointing to a specific passage, December 21st, 1998. "The boy saw me with Edward in the library. His eyes were just like his father's, full of premature wisdom. I promised I would take care of him if something happened to me, but now I know the promise must be reversed. He is the one who will take care of her when the time comes. Do you know who Edward is?" "Not my father." "Edward Montgomery." Caleb closed the diary but kept his fingers marking the page. "And she is you, Abigail. Your mother knew she would die before being able to tell you the truth about your paternity. She also knew that I would be the only one capable of helping you discover who you really are." The apartment seemed to spin around Abigail, the photographs on the walls transforming into fragments of a broken kaleidoscope. "Are you saying that—" "I'm saying that you are my half-sister, Abigail, daughter of Edward Montgomery and Hope Pierce, and that your mother spent her entire life trying to protect you from an inheritance she considered cursed." Caleb opened the diary again, this time on a page where strange symbols mixed with words in Latin. "But I'm also saying that's not why you're here." "Then why?" "Because genetics is capricious, Abigail. Because sometimes half-siblings meet without knowing their kinship and feel an attraction that transcends the rational. Because desire doesn't recognize family taboos when these were built on lies." Caleb stood up and walked to the window, contemplating the city blinking below like an artificial constellation. "And because your mother, in her last letter, asked me to do something that goes beyond fraternal protection." "What?" "To free you, completely. From the fears, the repression, the lies that shaped your personality. To show you who you really are when you're not trying to be the daughter Hope wanted to have." He turned to face her, and in his eyes Abigail saw something that made her tremble. "But this liberation can only happen if you trust me enough to surrender to the process. Without questioning, without resistance, without the fear of discovering that you might be exactly the woman your mother most feared you would become." Abigail felt that she was on the edge of an abyss, about to take a leap that would transform her forever. She could still get up, take the diary, leave that apartment and try to build a normal life based on the comfortable lies that Hope had constructed. Or she could accept the challenge in Caleb's eyes and discover what creature existed beneath the layers of religious conditioning. "If I accept," she said, her voice coming out firmer than she expected, "how do I know I can trust you?" Caleb smiled, and this time the smile had something both fierce and tender about it. "You can't. That's exactly the point, Abigail. True trust only exists when it is given without guarantees, and true liberation only happens when we stop trying to control the outcome." He approached again, stopping in front of her with the diary in his hands. "First test," he said, extending the notebook to her. "Read aloud the passage from March 15th, 1997, page 47. And while you read, take off that blouse." Abigail held the diary with hands that trembled imperceptibly, leafing through the pages until finding the mentioned date. Hope's handwriting danced before her eyes, the words seeming to pulse with their own life in the golden light of the apartment. Caleb remained standing in front of her, motionless as a statue, but she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical caress that traveled every inch of her skin. March 15th, 1997, she read, her voice coming out weaker than she would have liked. "The body is a profaned cathedral, but not by the sins we imagine. It is profaned by fear, by denial, by the refusal to accept that we were created to feel pleasure." Her hands found the buttons of her blouse, hesitating. Caleb said nothing, just waited, and in the silence Abigail found courage to continue both the reading and the undressing. Edward touched me today for the first time, she continued, her fingers undoing the first button. Not with lust, but with reverence, as if my skin were a sacred parchment where he could read divine secrets. The second button came, undone, revealing the base of her neck. I then understood that all the years of flagellation, all the nights on my knees in the cold, all the punitive fasts were nothing but cowardice. Cowardice in the face of the most fundamental truth. We are flesh that longs for flesh, soul that is only completed in fusion with another soul. Abigail paused, her fingers suspended over the third button. The air in the apartment seemed to have thickened, charged with an electricity that made every nerve ending in her body awaken to sensations she had never experienced. Caleb remained motionless, but something in his posture had changed, an almost imperceptible tension that suggested an effort to maintain control. "Continue," he said, his voice hoarse. "He made me sit in front of the mirror," read Abigail, the third button yielding under her fingers. "He forced me to look at myself, while his hands explored the territory that I had learned to consider forbidden. It wasn't violation, it was revelation. I saw in my own eyes reflections of a woman I never knew existed." The fourth button, then the fifth. The blouse opened like petals of a dark flower, revealing the white camisole she wore underneath. Thin fabric that didn't hide the shapes that hope had taught her to conceal. I saw that my breasts were not causes for shame, but promises of pleasure. That my waist was not anatomical sin, but sacred geography. That my thighs were not diabolical temptations, but paths to earthly paradises. Abigail felt blood pulsing at her temples, her breathing becoming irregular. Her mother's words echoed in her own voice, but it was as if someone else were pronouncing them, someone braver, more aware of her own sensuality. Caleb moved for the first time since she had begun reading, circling the sofa like a predator studying prey. "The blouse, too," he said, stopping behind her. Abigail could feel his presence like heat radiating at her back, could hear his controlled breathing, could sense the effort he was making not to touch her. She let the blouse slip from her shoulders, falling to the floor like a dead leaf. She sat there just in the camisole, more exposed than she had been in her entire adult life, but strangely not feeling vulnerable. Instead, she experienced something she couldn't name, a sensation of power that came precisely from the exposure, as if she were discovering that nudity could be a weapon, not a defeat. "Continue," ordered Caleb, his voice now clearly affected. "When he touched me," continued Abigail, turning the page, "I understood that God did not create the body to be an empty temple, but to be an instrument of ecstasy. Each caress was a prayer, each moan a hymn, each shiver a communion with the divine." Her own voice was changing, becoming deeper, more sensual, as if Hope's words were awakening a dormant persona within her. "I discovered that I had power over him, power that emanated exactly from what I had been taught to hide. My breasts under his palms made him tremble like a boy. My voice whispering his name transformed him from master to willing slave. My body arching under his caresses converted him from lord to servant." Abigail paused, feeling something wet between her legs, a new sensation that frightened and excited her simultaneously. Caleb appeared in front of her again, but now he was closer, close enough for her to see the accelerated pulse in his neck, the way he clenched his fists to maintain control. "You feel it, don't you?" he asked, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. "You feel what she felt when she wrote this, the power that comes from conscious surrender, not forced submission." Abigail nodded, unable to speak. She did feel it, felt as if she were awakening from a 28-year coma, as if every cell in her body were being activated for the first time. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time, like discovering that she had always been capable of flying, but no one had taught her to use her wings. "Last passage from this entry," said Caleb, pointing to the end of the page. "Read it." "He made me a promise before leaving," read Abigail, her voice now firm, controlled. "He said that our daughter, when she grew up, would be free from the chains that bind me, that she would find someone capable of showing her the pleasures that were denied to me, the secrets that I learned too late. He swore that she would never know the hunger for affection that consumes me, would never feel shame for her own body, would never confuse repression with purity." She raised her eyes to meet his, seeing in them something that made her understand that those words were more than confession, they were prophecy. "Our daughter will be goddess where I was slave," she concluded, closing the diary. And the man who awakens her to her divine nature will be both her liberator and her equal. The silence that followed was dense, charged with meanings that neither dared to verbalize yet. Caleb knelt before the sofa, at the height of her eyes, but still not touching. "Do you understand now why you're here, Abigail? Why your mother sent you to me? To fulfill the promise," she whispered, "to free me from the chains she couldn't break alone. And are you willing to continue? Knowing that there's no going back, that each test will take you further from who you thought you were, and closer to who you really are." Abigail looked around the apartment, registering each detail as if it were the last time she would see the world, with the eyes of who she had been until that moment. The photographs on the walls, the books on the shelves, the city blinking outside like a parallel universe. Everything seemed suspended in expectation, awaiting her decision. "How many tests are there?" she asked. 7, one for each day of the week of creation. One for each layer of conditioning that needs to be removed. Caleb stood up, walking to a shelf where he retrieved a small carved wooden box. "Each will demand that you surrender something you've always kept as sacred. Each will force you to confront fears you didn't even know you possessed. And after the 7, afterward you'll be free to choose who you want to be. Free from hope's lies, free from my manipulations. Free to love or hate, to stay or leave, to surrender or preserve yourself." He opened the box, revealing 7 sealed envelopes, each marked with a different symbol. But you need to understand that this freedom has a price. Some truths, once discovered, cannot be forgotten. Abigail observed the envelopes like someone contemplating tarot cards that would reveal the future. Each seemed to pulse with dark promises, with challenges that would test not only her courage, but her ability to recognize herself in a version of herself that might be completely different from the one Hope had created. "The second test," said Caleb, removing an envelope marked with the symbol of a crescent moon, "happens tomorrow night. You will have 24 hours to decide if you want to continue." He extended the envelope to her. "If you come, bring the necklace your mother left you, and wear something she would never approve of." Abigail took the envelope, feeling the paper burn her fingers like heated metal. She knew that inside were instructions that would take her even further from the safe world of repression, even closer to the dangerous territory of uncontrolled desire. But she also knew there was no going back. The process had begun, and every cell in her body clamored for continuity. "And if I don't come, then you'll return to Virginia with a good amount of money and the certainty that you lost the only chance to discover who you really are." Caleb approached her one last time, leaning until his lips almost touched her ear. "But we both know you'll come, Abigail, because you recognize in me the only man capable of showing you the pleasures your mother experienced and that you inherited by right." He moved away, heading to the door. "Rebecca will take you home. And Abigail," he paused, his hand on the doorknob, "tonight for the first time in your life, sleep naked. Feel your own skin. Explore your own body. Discover the secrets that Hope tried to bury. Consider this part of the second test." The door closed behind him, leaving Abigail alone with the envelope in her hand and a silent revolution happening in every nerve ending of her body. She put on her blouse with automatic movements, but she knew that something fundamental had changed. The woman who would descend those stairs was not the same one who had climbed them 2 hours before. Abigail spent the night awake, her body restless in a bed that seemed to have shrunk since she returned from Caleb's apartment. For the first time in her life, she followed his suggestion and undressed completely before lying down, feeling the sheets touch her skin with an intimacy that made her shiver. Each movement, each change of position, revealed unexplored territories of her own body, sensations that Hope had taught her to ignore, but which now pulsed with their own life. She explored herself timidly in the dark, her fingers trembling, as they discovered curves and textures that had always existed, but had never been recognized as hers. Each touch was a small betrayal of her mother's teachings, each sigh a declaration of independence. When she finally fell asleep, already with the first glimmer of dawn insinuating itself through the curtains, she dreamed of hands that were not hers caressing her skin, of voices whispering words she didn't understand, but which her body recognized as invitations to forbidden pleasures. At the office, the next morning, she pretended to concentrate on reports while observing Caleb through the glass partition. He seemed different, more predatory, as if the previous night had activated some dormant instinct in him. When their eyes met, she felt an electric current run down her spine, a physical connection that went beyond attraction and entered the territory of mutual recognition. It was as if both knew they had crossed a line that could not be undone. During lunch, Rebecca approached her desk carrying a folder that wasn't on the daily schedule. "Mr. Montgomery asked you to organize some old files in the basement depository," she said, her voice neutral but her eyes carrying a meaning that Abigail couldn't decipher. "They're confidential documents from the 90s. He said you would know what to look for." Abigail descended to the building's basement with her heart racing, knowing it wasn't a coincidence that she was being sent to files from the exact period when her mother had worked for the Montgomery family. The depository was a labyrinth of metal shelves that were lost in the dimness, illuminated only by fluorescent lamps that created more shadows than light. The air smelled of old paper and kept secrets, like a crypt where corporate sins were buried. She found the section from the 90s in one of the deepest wings, where dusty boxes kept the fragments of a decade that the company seemed to prefer to forget. On the labels it read, "Human Resources 1995-1998, Security Incidents, Legal Issues Confidential." Abigail opened the first box with trembling hands, finding employee dossiers that had the meticulous organization of someone who didn't want to leave details behind. Her mother's name appeared in a folder marked with red ink. Hope Pierce, case closed, restricted access. Inside, photographs she had never seen. Hope Young in a housekeeper's uniform, smiling on a porch that Abigail recognized from the photos in Caleb's apartment. Medical reports that spoke of emotional instability and episodes of pathological jealousy. Testimonies from other employees describing obsessive behavior and unrequited fixation. But it was the psychiatric reports that revealed the darkest truth. Hope had been institutionalized after the incident of December 1998, diagnosed with puerperal psychosis and persecutory delusions. The doctors reported that she insisted on claiming that Edward Montgomery had promised to marry her after the birth of their daughter, that the legitimate wife was preventing the union ordered by God, that the child was proof of the sacred love that would justify any extreme act. Abigail felt her legs weaken. Her mother had not just been a rejected lover. She had been a woman in psychiatric crisis who had confused obsession with divine love. And she, Abigail, was the child not of a forbidden romance, but of a relationship born from mental illness and ending in violence. She continued reading, seeking more pieces of the puzzle that her life was revealing itself to be. She found security reports that described the incident in clinical detail. Hope had invaded the family wing of the mansion on a December night, armed with a kitchen knife, proclaiming that God had ordered the purification of the house through the blood of the usurper. She had been intercepted by Edward before she could reach the bedroom where his wife and legitimate son slept. In the struggle that followed, she had severely wounded his arm before being restrained by security guards. But the detail that made Abigail understand the full complexity of the situation was in an additional report, written by Edward himself. The child witnessed the entire scene. Caleb, 11 years old, tried to protect the intruder, shouting that she wasn't bad, just sick. He showed obsessive concern about the whereabouts of Hope's daughter, insisting that someone needed to take care of the little girl. Psychological counseling is recommended for the minor. Abigail then understood that Caleb carried survivor's guilt, that his obsession with her was born from a child's need to protect the daughter of the woman who had almost destroyed his family. But there was something more between the lines of the reports, something that made her hands tremble as she turned the pages. Edward Montgomery had not denied paternity. On the contrary, there were specific instructions for discreet financial provisions to be made to ensure the welfare of the minor Abigail, provided that she remained distanced from the family. The sound of footsteps echoing between the shelves made her quickly hide the documents. Caleb emerged from the shadows, like the materialization of her own thoughts, walking among the boxes with the familiarity of someone who knew every secret kept in those basements. He stopped in front of her, observing the papers spread on the improvised table, and smiled with a satisfaction that had something cruel about it. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked, his voice echoing in the silence of the depository. "You knew I would find this," said Abigail, not as a question, but as a statement. "You wanted me to discover the truth about my mother." "Part of the truth," corrected Caleb, approaching until he was close enough for her to feel his body heat. "The part that the medical reports tell. But there's another version of the story, Abigail. A version that only those who were there can know." "Which version?" "The version where a woman in love was used by a married man who promised her a future he never intended to give. Where mental illness was a convenient diagnosis to cover up the fact that Edward Montgomery deliberately seduced a vulnerable employee, impregnated her with false promises, and then discarded her when the situation became inconvenient." Caleb's voice carried a bitterness that went beyond the personal, as if he himself had been a victim of the same manipulations. "But she tried to kill your stepmother. After months of being convinced that she was the true wife, that my father's legal marriage was merely a social arrangement, that God approved of their union." Caleb picked up one of the photographs where Hope smiled on the porch. "My father was a specialist in finding fragile women and molding them according to his needs. Hope was just one more on a long list." Abigail felt something collapse inside her chest. "So I am the daughter of a predator and his victim, the product of a manipulation that ended in tragedy. But also—" Caleb lightly touched her face, the first intimate physical contact since they had met. "Also the most extraordinary woman I've ever known. Not despite your origin, but because of it. Because you carry in your blood both the capacity to love intensely and the strength to survive betrayal." His touch burned her skin like a hot iron, awakening sensations that the first test had only suggested. Abigail felt torn between revolt at the evident manipulation and an attraction that grew proportionally to her understanding of Caleb's psychological complexity. He wasn't just the powerful man he appeared to be, but also the traumatized child who had witnessed her mother's madness and assumed the responsibility to protect her. "The second test," she said, her voice coming out hoarser than intended. "I need to know what you want from me before I continue." Caleb smiled, but this time the smile had something vulnerable about it, as if he himself wasn't certain of his own motivations. From his pocket, he took out an envelope that she recognized as being for the second test. "I want you to come to my apartment tonight, wearing your mother's necklace and something she would never approve of. I want you to read to me a specific passage from the diary, one you haven't discovered yet. And I want—" He hesitated as if the next words were difficult even for him. "I want you to let me touch you as my father touched her. Not to repeat his mistakes, but to heal the wounds he caused. And if I don't want to, then you'll leave Chicago tomorrow with enough money to start over anywhere. No resentment, no demands." Caleb moved away, creating physical space between them. "But also without answers, Abigail. Without knowing who you really are when you stop pretending to be the daughter Hope wanted to have." Abigail watched him walking between the shelves, disappearing into the shadows of the depository, like a ghost returning to the world of the dead. She remained alone among the scattered documents, among the photographs that told a story of love and madness, among the evidence that her entire life had been built on more fragile foundations than she had imagined. But there was something stronger than fear growing in her chest. Curiosity. Curiosity about the passage from the diary she hadn't yet discovered, about the sensations that Caleb's touch might awaken, about the woman who might exist beneath the layers of religious conditioning. And also, she admitted to herself as she put away the documents, a dangerous excitement at the prospect of finally experiencing the pleasures that Hope had known, and from which she had tried to protect her. That night, she prepared herself like a warrior preparing for battle. She chose a red dress she had bought on impulse, but never had the courage to wear, a color that Hope considered proper for prostitutes. She fastened her mother's necklace around her throat, feeling the cold metal against her heated skin. She looked at herself in the mirror, the first mirror where she saw herself, entirely since arriving in Chicago, and recognized in the reflected image a woman who was neither the repressed Abigail of childhood nor some idealized version of freedom. It was something new, hybrid, dangerous. It was who she had always been beneath the gray dresses and whispered prayers. And for the first time in her life, she liked what she saw. Abigail climbed the stairs of Caleb's building with steps that echoed like drum beats announcing her own transformation. The red dress embraced her body in a way that made each movement seem like a seductive dance, each step a declaration of war against 28 years of repression. Her mother's necklace weighed on her neck like a golden chain, reminding her that she carried not only her own desires, but the ghosts of a passion that had ended in tragedy. Caleb was waiting for her with the door open, as if he had sensed her arrival. He wore only a white shirt open at the first few buttons and dark pants, his bare feet suggesting a domestic intimacy that contrasted with the corporate power he emanated during the day. His eyes traveled over her body with an avidity he didn't try to disguise, lingering on the neckline that revealed the beginning of her breasts, on the waist accentuated by the tight fabric, on the legs that the short dress left exposed. "Red," he said, his voice laden with approval. "The color of sin, according to your mother. The color of life, according to nature." He stepped away from the door, inviting her to enter with a gesture that had something ceremonious about it. "You look beautiful, Abigail. You look like yourself for the first time since I've known you." The apartment was different from the night before. Candles had been strategically placed, creating a golden illumination that transformed the modern environment into something primitive, almost ritualistic. The piano was open, the keys reflecting the trembling light like the teeth of a dormant beast. On the coffee table, her mother's diary waited beside a bottle of wine and 2 crystal glasses. "Would you like something to drink before we begin?" asked Caleb, serving wine without waiting for an answer. The dark liquid fell into the glasses like sacred blood, creating a hypnotic sound that seemed to echo in the loaded silence. "It's a Bordeaux from 1998, the same wine my father served Hope on the nights he visited her." Abigail accepted the glass, feeling the cold glass against her heated fingers. "You planned this from the beginning, didn't you? From the moment you discovered I was alive, you planned to bring me here." "I didn't plan it. I dreamed it." Caleb took a sip, his eyes never leaving her face. "For years I dreamed of the moment when I could correct my father's mistakes, when I could give you what he denied your mother. Not just physical pleasure, but recognition, acceptance, love without blackmail or manipulations. And how can I be sure that this isn't just a more sophisticated manipulation?" "You can't." The brutal honesty of the answer surprised her. Just as Hope couldn't be certain of Edward's intentions, the difference is that I'm being transparent about my agenda. I want you, Abigail, not as a trophy or as a way to expiate family guilt. I want you because I recognize in your eyes the same hunger that exists in mine. He approached, stopping close enough for her to feel the heat from his body. "The second test requires you to read a specific passage from the diary. Page 73, entry of August 20th, 1998. And while you read," he extended his hand, his fingers lightly touching the necklace she wore. "I need to touch you as he touched her, to understand what she felt, to comprehend the source of the power she held over him." Abigail felt a tremor run down her spine, part fear, part anticipation. "And if I can't let you touch me, then we'll stop immediately, without questions, without judgments." Caleb stepped back, creating space between them. "But I think you can, Abigail. I think you've been hungry to be touched for longer than you imagine." She walked to the sofa with deliberately slow steps, aware that he observed every movement, every sway of her hips, every muscle tension that the dress revealed. She sat down and opened the diary to the indicated page, finding a handwriting different from the other entries, more hurried, more feverish, as if Hope had written in a state of extreme excitement. "August 20th, 1998, she began reading, her voice coming out firmer than expected. "He came today not as a lover, but as one possessed. He said he could no longer sleep without dreaming of my body, that I had become an obsession consuming his sanity." Caleb approached from behind the sofa, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. The touch was gentle, almost respectful, but Abigail felt as if small electric discharges traveled across her skin. "He made me kneel before the mirror while he undid my hair," she continued, feeling Caleb's fingers finding the bun that held her own hair. One by one the pins were removed, allowing the dark tresses to fall over her shoulders like a silky curtain. He said he wanted to see my reflection while he possessed me, wanted me to witness my own transformation from saint to sinner. Caleb's hands slid down her shoulders, descending along her arms with a touch that seemed to map every inch of skin. Abigail felt her breathing become irregular, her body responding in ways she didn't know. It was as if each caress activated nerve endings that had remained dormant her entire life. "When he touched me," she read, her voice beginning to falter, "I understood that my body didn't belong only to me. It also belonged to him, to the desire he had awakened in us both, to the sacred sin that united us in a communion deeper than any sacrament." Caleb's fingers found the accelerated pulse in her neck, remaining there as if he wanted to feel life flowing beneath her skin. It was power and submission simultaneously. Each moan he drew from me made me more powerful, because it proved my ability to reduce such a controlled man to a hungry animal. Each caress I received made me more submissive, because I discovered levels of need I didn't know I possessed. Caleb's hand slid down the front of her dress, stopping at the height of her heart that beat erratically. "Continue," he whispered, his voice hoarse with contained desire. "He made me look in the mirror while his hands explored territories I thought I knew," read Abigail, feeling Caleb's palms traveling over her ribs, her waist, her hips with a touch that was becoming more daring. "I saw a woman I had never known existed, a creature made of hunger and fullness, of surrender and power, of profane sanctity and sanctified sin." Caleb knelt beside the sofa, at the height of her eyes. For the first time since the caresses began, she could see his face, register the almost painful intensity of his gaze, the evident struggle between desire and control. "Do you see?" he asked, his right hand resting over her racing heart. "Do you see how your body recognizes what your mind still tries to deny?" Abigail nodded, unable to speak. She felt as if she were awakening from an erotic coma, discovering that she possessed a body capable of pleasures that surpassed anything she had imagined. Each of Caleb's touches awakened cascading sensations, one connecting to another in a symphony of sensory discoveries. "Last passage from this entry," said Caleb, pointing to the end of the page. "Read." "When he finished," read Abigail, her voice now clearly affected by excitement, "we remained embraced before the mirror, observing our intertwined reflections. He whispered a promise that sealed our destiny. He said that our daughter, when she grew up, would know the love he had taught me to give, that she would find a man capable of adoring her as he adored me, but without the lies that poisoned our union." She paused, suddenly understanding the meaning of those words. "He promised that she would be free from the chains that bind me," she continued, the last words coming out as a whisper, "that she would be loved without guilt, desired without shame, possessed without fear, and that the man who awakened her to her divine nature would be both protector and lover, both savior and equal." The silence that followed was dense, loaded with revelations that changed everything Abigail thought she knew about her origin and destiny. Caleb remained kneeling beside the sofa, his hand still over her heart, observing her with an intensity that went beyond physical desire. "Do you understand now?" he asked. "Why your mother sent you to me? Why I've carried this responsibility since childhood, to fulfill the promise your father made to her, to give me the love he couldn't give her." Abigail closed the diary, her hands trembling. "But also," she looked directly into his eyes, seeing there a vulnerability he tried to hide, "also because you need this as much as I do. You need to correct the mistakes of the past. You need to prove that you're different from him." Caleb nodded, unable to deny the truth she had just verbalized. "The next 5 tests will take you further than you imagine, Abigail. They will force you to confront fears, desires, aspects of your personality that you don't even suspect you possess. Are you sure you want to continue?" Abigail looked around the candle-lit apartment, registered the warmth emanating from Caleb's body, felt the moisture between her legs that proved her body had already made the decision for her. She was scared, excited, confused, and completely alive for the first time in her existence. "I am," she said, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. "But with one condition, which I want to know everything about my mother, about your father, about what really happened on that December night. And I want to know your true intentions with me. Not just what you say you feel, but what you intend to do when the 7 tests are over." Caleb smiled, but this time the smile had something dangerous about it, as if she had just agreed to participate in a game whose rules were more complex than she imagined. "Very well. But prepare yourself, Abigail. The complete truth may be more disturbing than any fantasy you've constructed about the past." He stood up, walking to a shelf where he removed a small golden key. "There's a secret compartment in the necklace you're wearing. Your mother hid something there that will change everything you think you know about our family history." Abigail touched the necklace with trembling fingers, finding a small protrusion she had never noticed before. The key turned easily, revealing a tiny compartment from which Caleb removed a paper folded multiple times. "Hope's real suicide note," he said, extending the document to her. "The one she wrote but never sent. The one that explains why she really tried to kill my stepmother, and why her death wasn't an accident." Abigail unfolded the paper with hands that trembled like leaves in the wind, knowing she was about to discover secrets that could destroy any possibility of future happiness, but also knowing there was no turning back. The process of discovery had begun, and each revelation took her deeper into a labyrinth where the only exit was to move forward until finding the center, where all truths would finally be revealed. The letter fluttered in Abigail's hands like a dry leaf in the wind, the words dancing before her eyes as the weight of the final truth was revealed. Hope's handwriting, now familiar after so many readings of the diary, told a story that transformed everything she thought she knew about her origin into an even more complex web of passion, betrayal, and sacrifice. "My dear Abigail," she read in a low voice, the words echoing in the silent apartment where Caleb waited by the window, fists clenched in a tension that revealed that not even he knew the full content of that final confession. "If you are reading this letter, it's because you have finally found Caleb, and the time has come to know the truth that I spent your entire life trying to protect you from knowing." Abigail paused, her heart beating so hard she could hear her pulse in her own temples. "Edward Montgomery wasn't just my lover. He was my half-brother. Children of the same father, raised on opposite sides of society. He in the mansion, I in the abandoned caretaker's cottage, where our father hid his meetings with the servants. When we recognized each other as adults, the attraction was instantaneous and devastating. It wasn't just desire, it was the unhealthy magnetism of blood recognizing itself in a forbidden dance." Caleb turned sharply from the window, his face paling. "That's impossible. My grandfather died before I was born. There was never any mention of—" "Continue reading," said Abigail, her voice firm despite the emotional earthquake she felt in her chest. "We discovered the truth only after I became pregnant with you, my daughter. Edward investigated our genealogy to prepare paternity recognition documents and found certificates that proved our kinship. The child I was carrying wasn't just the daughter of forbidden lovers, it was the product of incest. And worse, Edward discovered that I had always known, that I had consciously chosen to seduce my own half-brother, because I wanted to create a child who would carry our lineage concentrated, pure, free from the dilutions that conventional marriages impose." The apartment seemed to shrink around them, the walls closing like giant fists. Abigail felt nausea rising in her throat, but forced herself to continue, knowing that only the complete truth could free her from the chains that Hope had forged with her protective lies. "When he rejected me, it wasn't out of morality or fear of social scandal. It was out of horror, at discovering that he had been manipulated in a plot I had orchestrated from the beginning. I tried to kill him that December night, not out of rejected love, but out of rage at being discovered. And you, my daughter, are the product of this conscious sin that I committed against God and nature." Abigail's hands trembled so much she could barely hold the paper. "That's why I raised you far from the world, far from mirrors, far from anything that might awaken in you the same perverse hunger that consumed me." Caleb approached slowly, like someone approaching a wounded animal. "Abigail." "I'm not finished yet," she said, forcing herself to read to the end despite the tears that were beginning to blur her vision. "But there's something else you need to know, my daughter, something I discovered only days before deciding to leave this world. Caleb is not your half-brother as I thought all these years. Edward adopted the boy when he was 5, after the death of his biological parents in an accident, which means that you don't share blood, that the attraction you may feel for each other doesn't carry the curse that poisoned my existence." The paper fell from Abigail's hands like a withered petal, landing on the floor between her and Caleb as a bridge of revelations that changed everything. She looked at him through her tears, seeing no longer the half-brother she had believed him to be, but a man who carried his own scars, his own fears, his own need for redemption. "She planned everything," whispered Caleb, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. Hope planned for you to find me, for us to discover the truth, for—" He stopped as if the next words were too difficult to pronounce. "For us to fall in love, because she knew only then would you be completely free from the guilt she carried her entire life." Abigail stood up from the sofa with automatic movements, walking to the window where the city stretched infinite beneath the night sky. She felt as if she had just been born, as if 28 years of existence had been merely a prologue to this moment when she finally understood who she was and what she could choose to be. "The other 5 tests," she said, without turning to face him. "Do I still need to go through them?" "Not in the way I originally planned." Caleb approached from behind, stopping close enough for her to feel his warmth but without touching her. "Because now I understand that you don't need to be liberated by me. You need to liberate yourself through your own choices, your own discoveries. And if I choose to leave, if I decide that I've carried lies for too long and want to start from scratch somewhere where nobody knows my story, then I'll help you leave, without resentment, without demands." The honesty in his voice made her finally turn to face him, "but also without lies about what I feel for you, Abigail. I love you. Not because of the promise I made to a 7-year-old child, not because of the guilt I carry for my adoptive father's mistakes, not because of the desire to correct past tragedies. I love you for the extraordinary woman you've discovered yourself to be, for the courage with which you face truths that would destroy weaker people." Abigail studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation, traces of the lies she had learned to identify in the men she had known through the accounts in her mother's diary. But she found only raw vulnerability, genuine fear that she might leave, sincere desire that she would stay not out of obligation, but by free choice. "And what would happen if I stayed?" she asked. "What would our life together be like, knowing everything we know about our past?" "It would be what we want it to be, without pacts sealed by previous generations, without inherited promises, without predetermined destinies." Caleb extended his hand, an offer, not a demand. It would be love built day by day, a choice renewed each morning, passion that is born of freedom, not compulsion. Abigail looked at the outstretched hand, remembering all the times Hope had forbidden her to touch and be touched, all the years she had learned to see her own body as forbidden territory. Now, for the first time in her life, she could choose. She could accept or refuse, stay or leave, love or preserve herself. She extended her own hand, intertwining her fingers with his in a gesture that sealed not an ancestral pact, but a present decision. "Then let's discover together who we can be when we stop pretending to be other people." The kiss that followed wasn't an explosion of repressed passion, but a gentle recognition of 2 people who had finally found each other without disguises. Caleb's lips were soft, warm, patient. They didn't demand, they offered. They didn't conquer, they invited. Abigail felt herself awakening to sensations that were completely her own, not echoes of others' experiences or projections of forbidden fantasies. When they separated, she smiled for the first time since arriving in Chicago. A smile that came from within, free from the shadows of the past, free from the expectations of the future. It was the smile of someone who had finally discovered that freedom wasn't in the absence of connections, but in the ability to consciously choose with whom and how to connect. "There's something else you need to know," said Caleb, walking to a shelf where he retrieved a small velvet box. "Hope didn't die in the fire, Abigail. She killed herself before the flames reached the room where she was. The reports I read confirm it. Self-induced carbon monoxide poisoning. She set fire to the house after making the decision, so you would think it was an accident." Abigail received the information with a serenity that surprised her. "To protect me from guilt," she said, understanding. "So I could live without carrying the weight of knowing that my existence caused her so much suffering. But also," continued Caleb, opening the box to reveal a small ornate key, "so that you would inherit something she kept for you her entire life. This key opens a safe deposit box at First National Bank, where documents are stored that prove your true inheritance. Edward left everything to you in a secret will, made before he died in a car accident 3 years ago. You are the legitimate heir to the Montgomery fortune, Abigail. You don't need me for financial security or social position." Abigail took the key, feeling the cold metal against her heated skin. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the last revelation that made her completely free to choose her own destiny. She was no longer the poor orphan dependent on a powerful man's charity. She was a wealthy, independent woman, capable of living the life she wanted to live. "Now I understand why Hope did all this," she said, tucking the key into the neckline of her red dress. "She wasn't just protecting me from my own nature. She was preparing me for a moment when I could choose love for love's sake, not out of necessity." "And what is your choice?" Abigail walked to the piano, her fingers touching the keys in a hesitant melody that became more confident as she gained courage. It was the first music she had played in her life, notes that sprang directly from her soul without the intermediation of sheet music or teachers. It was pure music, direct expression of feelings that no longer needed to be censored. "My choice," she said without stopping playing, "is to stay. Not because you saved me, not because I owe something to the past, not because I'm afraid to face the world alone." She turned on the piano bench, facing him with eyes that shone with tears and determination. "But because I love you, because I recognize in you a man capable of loving me for who I am, not for what I represent. Because I want to discover who we can be together when we stop carrying the burdens that others placed on our shoulders." Caleb approached the piano, sitting beside her on the bench. His fingers found the keys in a melody that harmonized with hers, creating music that was the product of union, not of one voice dominating the other. It was the perfect metaphor for what they could build together, love based on partnership, not hierarchy. "Then let's start again," he said, his hands dancing over the keys in a symphony of infinite possibilities. Not as heirs to others' tragedies, not as fulfillment of ancestral promises, but as two people who chose to love each other freely. Abigail leaned over and kissed him again, this time with the passion that came from certainty, not compulsion. She felt her body responding in ways that were completely natural, completely her own. She was a woman who desired and was desired, who loved and was loved, who chose and saw her choices respected. When they separated, she smiled with a happiness she had never imagined possible. "You know what makes me happiest in all this?" she said, her hands still intertwined with his over the piano keys. "What?" "Discovering that after 28 years living as a shadow of myself, I can finally be who I always was, beneath the lies, the fears, and the chains. And that you love me exactly for that true woman, not in spite of her." Outside, Chicago pulsed with its infinite energy, millions of lives intertwining in a complex dance of dreams and desires. But inside that apartment, to the sound of a melody born from the union of two souls finally free to meet each other, Abigail and Caleb discovered that true love wasn't destiny written in the stars, but a choice renewed each day, built note by note.